It is my great pleasure to introduce my good friend Armin Medosh. Dr. Armin Medosh is a Vienna-based artist, curator, scholar, and author working in art and media theory. In 2014, Armin curated the international exhibition Fields at the Riga European Cultural Capital in 2014, and has curated and exhibited internationally in venues and countries such as the Center for Art and Creative Industries in Spain, the Limehouse Town Hall in London, NTT ICC in Tokyo, Japan, and the Yerba Buena Art Center in San Francisco, Ars Electronica in Linz, Austria, etc., etc. He's initiator of the Technopolitics Working Group in Vienna, and his new book, New Tendencies, Art at the Threshold of the Information Revolution, was published by MIT Press this past June. Armin attended the University of Music and Dramatic Arts in Graz, Austria from 82 to 85, earned a degree in philosophy and German literature from Karl-Franz Universität in 1982, a Master of Arts in Interactive Digital Media from Sussex University in England in 2005, and a PhD in Arts and Computational Technologies from Goldsmiths in 2012. Armin influenced me a great deal when I was just out of graduate school and living in Berlin. We met, I don't know if it was at Ars Electronica or the Dutch Electronic Arts Festival, but I was really inspired by his intellect and his interest in new media as both a scholar and a curator. And then our paths crossed again and again in the European new media art scene, and was maybe too much to call you a mentor, but you definitely helped show me the way. So it's really my pleasure to welcome Armin Medosh. Please put your hands together for Armin.
Thanks a lot, Mark, for such a nice introduction. It is indeed, it has been 20 years since we first met. I had been thinking about it. It was in '96, I think, at the European Media Arts Festival in Osnabrück. And then we all went to Amsterdam and Rotterdam at the back of a van, which were really different times. Yeah. And I would also say that Mark is a pioneer in his own right, and I recently have researched the early history of the NetTime mailing list. Mark is, of course, very well known for being founder of Rhizome list and project, but in the early days of NetTime, which is a very influential list, especially back then, in a critical discourse on the internet and net culture, Mark was one of the most frequent posters actually in the first 6 months. Today I will mostly talk about one subject, about my book which came out recently, and I hope you will find it interesting because it deals with a historical subject, but I think history is highly relevant for us today, because without understanding our past, we can also not properly understand our present and our future. As Mark has pointed out, I have mostly worked as a curator, also as an artist, but more as a sort of artist come curator in some in-between zones. And in 2006, actually before the Fields exhibition, in 2006 I curated an exhibition called Waves. The subtitle was Electromagnetic Waves as a Principal Medium of Art, and that was a big international exhibition. And then I did a practice-based PhD at Goldsmiths in England. Those practice-based PhDs, they are quite controversial, but I think they're really great because it gave me an entrance back into academia at a relatively mature phase of my life. And so I was planning to work on exhibitions as sites of research, and my idea was to theorize my own exhibition, Waves. And then after, I did part-time, after 2 or 3 years into my PhD, I realized that was a bit too much like navel gazing, and then I was in search of a proper case study, and I found the New Tendencies. Now, the New Tendencies, allow me a joke. Does anybody know where Yugoslavia is? Yes? Well, actually, it's nowhere because it doesn't exist anymore. New Tendencies emerged in 1961 in Zagreb, which is the capital of Croatia, which then belonged to the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. But the New Tendencies were an art movement which started in Yugoslavia, but then very soon had a very international dimension, and that's what I will talk about. But first, maybe a few words as a kind of introduction also to the sort of more theoretical side of things. When I started, this is my book, and it's basically a rewritten and expanded version of my PhD dissertation. So when I started the research on new tendencies, I had to ask myself, how do I deal with this subject matter? Because new tendencies, as I said, started in 1961 in Yugoslavia and actually lasted till 1978. It had 5 major exhibitions and festivals in Zagreb, but it also had other exhibitions in other places, such as the Biennale of Venice, Biennale of San Marino, Paris, the Louvre, and so on and so forth. So it was a really major international art movement, and over the sort of 15 years plus that this movement lasted, more than 350 artists participated in it. So how can you research such a vast subject area? How can you deal with 350 biographies? How can you bring that all together into one framework? And of course you can't. Yeah? You have to cut the network somehow. You have to find a way to close your research subject and to draw the boundary lines of where you say, this is my subject area and there it stops and I cannot deal with everything. Another question that I had to ask myself was that because new tendencies lasted for such a long time, I really had to deal with the subject of history. I had never before asked myself that question actually so closely, the question, what is history? Because in my opinion, I had this strong intention not to deal with art as an pure art subject, as art for the sake of art, but in the historical context of the time. But that historical context was changing over those 15 years and quite dramatically. So the new tendencies began in an era that you could still call the post-war era. The era not immediately afterwards, but still under the influence of the Second World War. And it stopped in the late 1970s when totally different social circumstances actually were happening. So what I did is I constructed a kind of historical framework, not to be misunderstood for a theory of history, but a sort of more open framework that allows me to contextualize new tendencies. And one of the key terms for that framework is the term Fordism. Fordism is among social scientists a term that characterizes the first 25 years after the Second World War, when there was a sort of heightened automation in industry, when there was an increase of new information technologies which were integrating with industries, not just in car production, but also the production of consumer goods. And this had severe social consequences. It led to things, there was a lot of literature at the time about the lonely person in the crowd, a new type of, it was not the working class anymore because the jobs changed, there were much more technicians involved and so on, and much more people working in office. So there came the white-collar worker became a focus of research, and also the notion of the organization man, the kind of faceless person in the crowd feeling alienated through this life. And in these circumstances, the new tendencies emerged as kind of art movement which tried to engage with those subjects. They actually wanted to make an art which was, for them, most adequate to this new time. But there was also another area, of course, another sort of zone of influence, and that's, of course, art. So art always reacts to other art. And the art situation after the Second World War was one which you probably know, this book, very well-known book, Serge Guilbeault, How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art. And it was this kind of shift from Paris being the capital of modern art to New York becoming the capital of modern art. also connected very strongly with a particular style of painting, which was abstract expressionism. And the most well-known name, of course, is Jackson Pollock. And there was also a sort of European version of that. In Paris, it was called informel, also sometimes tachisme, which tachisme is like to throw paint just on the canvas. And that was actually the situation that the new tendencies found when they started. That was the dominant style, on one hand, abstract expressionism, and then on the other hand, in the socialist East, you had socialist realism, a doctrine introduced by Stalin, where all the painters and sculptors were forced to work in a realist style. This post-war situation also had another aspect to it, which was that actually the immediate sort of rubble of the Second World War had been cleared out, and what began was a sort of new phase of modernization. And if you look at Yugoslavia, it was a country that you can say it was in a catching up process. The leading models were provided either by the United States of America or by the Soviet Union, and both actually promoted different forms of a sort of advanced industrialization, but the industrialization point was actually very similar. So if we look beyond the ideology, the sort of industrial models through large bureaucracies were very similar here and there. And in that situation, the Expo 1958 in Brussels was one of these first moments when actually the world came together to celebrate a time when after the Second World War a new optimism was coming out. And in this new optimism at the Expo in Brussels, all the nations presented themselves with the best way they could, and Yugoslavia presented itself with that. And that's very typical because it's from an architect who was one of the first abstract worker working in an abstract sort of neo-constructivist style after the Second World War in Zagreb. In Zagreb, they had already in the interwar years contact with the international style, with the avant-garde, with constructivism, and particularly in architecture with Le Corbusier. And this architect, Wenceslav Richter, he made something very daring. He wanted to build this Yugoslav pavilion just on this one pillar, this one stilt in the middle, and it should have been completely just hanging free of any support from below. And as so many things with Yugoslavia, it was very ambitious, but they couldn't do it. They could technically, they couldn't realize it, but aesthetically it was on the highest level, and this is a model, of course, and it was not realized in that form. But Yugoslavia at the time, and that's very important to know, it was not part of the Eastern Bloc. There was, after the Second World War, there was the Soviet zone of influence, the so-called Iron Curtain came down, and all the countries under direct influence of the Soviet Union, they were really less free in all aspects. But Yugoslavia broke with the Soviet Union in 1948, and they developed their own system. It was still socialism, but it was called, the most important aspect was self-management, self-government and self-management. So Yugoslavia developed a very interesting ideology, which was based on a local self-organization on the levels of companies, on the levels of education institutions, art, where actually the idea was, in principle, everything should be self-organizing. Very modern. It's a bit like in the 1990s when we heard about self-organization and this kind of decentralization, and all that was part of the Yugoslav state ideology. But again, there was a contradiction with reality, but still, because there was still also the League of Yugoslav Communists, the Communist Party, and in the end, they did not give away the centralized political power. So there was on one hand this ideology of self-management, on the other hand, this kind of centralized political power. And this was the first exhibition of new tendencies in Zagreb. As I said, at the time, the dominant styles were abstract expressionism in the West and socialist realism in the East. And new tendencies did something completely new. So to sum it up a little bit before I go into more detail, one new thing was participation. If you look at those works here, they had an invitation to be touched. You could touch those spheres, those were plastic spheres painted one side black, one side white, and you could turn them around and you could thus create your own patterns, your own images. We forget that this was new at the time. It was really the moment of emergence at the same time with Fluxus and happening of a sort of interactive and participatory art. So its participation is one thing. The other thing is they talked about programmed art, which had at the time nothing to do with computer, but the term programming was totally hot around 1960. If you programmed something, you created an experience in a sort of rational way, and that meant you you designed an algorithm which was later to be carried out. And if you look at the history of conceptual art, that's of course totally important. Sol LeWitt, the abstract, the paragraphs on conceptual art, where 10 years later he described exactly the same. So maybe this is something we can keep for discussion later, because actually there's one of the latest issue of October magazine is picking up on this relationship between the European artists of new tendencies, in particular François Morellet, and the conceptual artists. So we have the participation, we have the programmed art or algorithmic art, and the third thing was art as visual research. The artists of new tendencies were fervently against the myth of the artistic genius, and they wanted to fight the myth of the artistic genius with the notion of research. And they thought that by completely stopping to use the word art, they always spoke about visual research. They stopped talking about art. And by that, they could completely change the approach to art. It was not about the individual anymore. It was not about the holiness of the artwork imbued with some sort of religious sort of motives and so on. And it was about doing research and sharing the results. It's also important to note that New Tendencies was from the very start not a Yugoslav or Croatian thing. The very first exhibition was actually initiated and mostly curated by this man, Almir Mavinier da Silva, an artist from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, who at the time developed a friendship with the Croatian critic Matko Mestrovic, and Mavinier and Mestrovic together created the first New Tendencies exhibition. And that's another strand that's very interesting, because Mavinier at the time was teaching at the College of Design Ulm, which was an amazing place. It was founded in 1953 by Germans who had suffered under Hitler. It was founded as a way of using design to fight fascism, creating design for a democratic society. And what they developed there was actually taking up the latest influences from the United States. So at College of Design Ulm, they were actually teaching information aesthetics and cybernetics in courses relating to design. Cybernetics was invented around 1948. Claude Shannon, Mathematical Theory of Communication, also 1948. And in 1953, they introduced that into a curriculum in Germany. Those ideas, where they were coming from, were actually coming from the Bauhaus, from the interwar years. So you could say there was a Bauhaus aesthetic, and through people such as Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, it came to the United States, and then information technology came to Europe and was kind of recombined with the Bauhaus ideas and then brought back to the United States, which we will see later. Here is a room at the first exhibition by an Italian group, Group N. Group N from Padua, which also happens to be the hometown of Toni Negri. I don't know, you know, Toni Negri is one of the kind of most left-wing philosophers of a direction called autonomous Marxism. And Gruppo N were sort of influenced already by that, or maybe they influenced Toni Negri. So they had very strong ideas about group work, about collectivity, about working as a collective, and also as a collective working for the collective good. So they really tried to theorize how, as an artist in a capitalist society, they were cultural producers, how their work as cultural producers would then become part of a commodity market and be bought and sold as commodities, and how they could deal with that, how could they address that. And one thing that they did was that they actually, they founded a group. First of all, they tried to be a collective. But secondly, also, they actively subverted authorship. Here you can see them, very sort of fashionable black and white photography on the rooftop of their studio in Padua. And you can see them holding a work. And they made quite a few versions of that work. Here it actually is. And they always signed it with the group identity, and then they also signed it with the name of the artist who actually made it. So they completely subverted the notion of individual genius and authorship with the kind of the way how they dealt with the authorship of the work. And another aspect is that they used kind of cheap materials. This is some plastic ribbons that they just used with a foreground and background. And that was a really important aspect for them. So this collectively signing or even keeping the work totally anonymous under the group identity, and the group identity was the letter N. And another aspect was this using cheap industrial materials to subvert the notion of the valuable artwork that is being bought and sold on the market. That work, actually, if you have it in real space, is also typical for a lot of this early work by New Tendencies. Because if I come from that direction, I maybe would see something like that. But if I pass by, suddenly the pattern would dramatically change. And a lot of the works of New Tendencies deployed such sort of visual effects, such optical effects, often based on research from Gestalt psychology. It's a special branch of psychology that uses the characteristics of our visual system and that certain sort of optical effects would happen. And in their view, that was also meant to, on one hand, subvert art, the notion of this kind of holy artwork, and on the other hand, it was about involving the viewer, getting the viewer to actively participate, because you could only experience the effect if you were walking by the artwork in a specific way. And that's something that happened with a lot of the other works. So American critic and curator Jack Burnham, who devoted a long chapter to the New Tendencies in his book Beyond Modern Sculpture, actually called it an aesthetics of the relational field. You're probably familiar with the notion of relational aesthetics by Nicolas Bourriot. 30, 40 years earlier, actually, New Tendencies invented the aesthetics of the relational field. And that's another aspect. Nowadays, what maybe most people will first notice, it's all man. Yes, it was the area before the second feminism. But what's also important here, why I introduced this picture, the one in the middle, that's Matko Mestrovic, the co-curator of New Tendencies. I think what is important about New Tendencies, if we take a look at it, actually it sort of makes us revisit art history, and in particular the history of post-war modernism. And the history of post-war modernism has been very Eurocentric, very US-centric, and there are only a few big names, and there is also a certain narrative where you have, on one hand, the sort of geometric abstraction and the sort of neo-constructivist or so-called concrete art or art concrete, and on the other hand, you have conceptual art. And usually, it's like those things are totally opposite of each other. And New Tendencies, you could see that they combined aspects of this kind of constructivist tendency, but also of a sort of neo-Dadaist tendency. And that is underlined by the fact that this group, it was called Gorgona. The Gorgona group, which existed from 58 to 66, was a kind of proto-conceptualist group, conceptualism before the name. They had activities such as secret meetings, walks along the river, which were meant to be secret art classes. They made a magazine where one issue of the magazine consisted of empty pages. So they had a lot of this kind of early Dadaist spirit of total negation of everything. And that spirit was also part of New Tendencies. So we not only need to revisit modernism geographically to say there were other areas, such as former Yugoslavia, such as Japan with the Gutai group, but also we need to reconsider the relationship between constructivism, neo-Dadaism, or conceptual art on the other hand. Just to underline that fact further, for the first New Tendencies exhibition, the Italian artist Piero Manzoni was heavily involved. He sent 3 works to Zagreb. One was a work called Achrom, a colorless work. Second one was one of his lines, and that was the third one. In Yugoslavia, there was no open censorship, but it was probably quite sensible at the time that the curators did not include this in the exhibition. It would have meant to push things a little bit too hard. But then generally speaking, in New Tendencies, again referring to Jack Burnham, there were kind of 2 main directions. Actually, there were more than 2 directions, because every artist, every group, New Tendencies was like a network of networks. Many groups were a part of New Tendencies, and every group had its own aesthetics. But you could say there were 2 main directions. One direction was this sort of more rationally constructed, which did this programmed art with the idea of addressing the notion of alienation, of making people participate, activating the spectator to politicize them. So that was the more left-wing part, mainly the French and Italian groups actually. And there was another direction, like Group Zero, who just thought they didn't want to have to do anything with socialist politics. They thought that creating new aesthetic experiences was actually enough to change the world. So by opening people's sensibility to a new aesthetics, they would actually do much better in changing the world rather than having anything more ideologically or dogmatically driven, such as the French group GRAPH, the Groupe de Recherche des Arts Visuels, who were really like very sort of strong French rationalists, and I will come to that later. But Otto Piene, who then later, actually in 1965, he came to New York. He had an exhibition at Howard Weiss Gallery with his light ballet, and later he took over the job of György Kepes at the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at the MIT, where he worked for many years. And you can see his influence sometimes in a very subtle way. There's an exhibition of Carol Schneemann currently at New York University. And for instance, Piene helped her to make those balloons where she could fly and playing her cello. So Piene was specialized in inflatables, in outdoor spectacles, in these sort of things that were meant to liberate people from norms. But then at a certain point, I think in the 1970s, they became also quite spectacular. It became really the spectacle in a kind of sense how the French situation is meant it. And another point, I don't want to go into it too deep because it's a bit of a boring subject, information aesthetics as defined by the German theorist Max Bense. Here is an example, a painting by Almir Mavinier da Silva. Max Bense actually is one of the inventors of information aesthetics, which they tried to apply the theory of information or mathematical theory of communication by Claude Shannon to create an objective aesthetics. So they had wanted to have a mathematical formula to decide objectively what was most beautiful, which is, of course, I think immediately something nowadays everybody would assume that this is somehow slightly strange, that you would even think you can decide objectively what is the most beautiful. But nevertheless, at the time, this had a lot of currency with the artists, and they tried to define the work as a kind of macro sign which consisted of micro signs which were distributed somehow according to certain laws, and with their work they wanted to explore those laws that would have the most beautiful results. But as the time changed, the 1960s created a special dynamics, and pop music happened, the Beatles happened, and the New Tendencies became less sort of formally mathematically rigorous, and they explored another notion, the notion of homo ludens, man the player. So they created interactive artworks, participatory artworks, which were meant to trigger the sort of playful sense in human people, again with this idea of liberating them from norms, of activating people and making them more politically active. That also then went into a direction of new media, of making objects using electrical motors. Here, Gianni Colombo from Group T, where this kind of film celluloid is kind of pushed up and down, always creating new forms. And the great Italian author Umberto Eco, he wrote this book, The Open Artwork, in '62, and that was actually one of his inspirations for the open artwork, writing that these sort of works, they didn't have one fixed form, but they created a field of possibilities of how a viewer can relate to it. And that was his sort of notion of what he called arte programmata, a programmed art. And from there, the new tendencies kind of explored ever more bigger and different and forms of interaction. Another work of this kind, a large rotating disc with iron and magnets. And a lot of these works were actually shown in an exhibition by the Italian office equipment company Olivetti. So you had the most left-wing artists you could find at the time showing work in the showroom of Olivetti company. And this exhibition actually also traveled to the United States, had a few stopovers, was then brought to MoMA, and then it was lost in the vaults of MoMA, which is amazing. It should have been returned. So all these objects sort of don't really exist anymore because before they returned to Europe, they were sort of lost. But it's one of the sort of works of history, actually. No purpose intended, I'm sure, you know. But at the same time, and this is the kind of main subject chapter in my book, at the same time something else happened. As the artists from Gruppo N, Gruppo T, the French group Graf, they developed a programmed art sponsored by Olivetti. There were left-wing sociologists from a magazine called Quaderni Rossi journal, and they made militant research. They called it con ricerca, researching together with the workers. They went to the factories of Fiat and Olivetti, and they investigated what changes in industry were brought through hate and automation, and how could a sort of more militant working class movement react to that. And I think that's a really interesting crossing point, because Quaderni Rossi later continued to become operaio, which means workerism, and the workerist movement later turned to what is now known as autonomous Marxism, and autonomous Marxism developed since the 1970s and increasingly in the 1990s very interesting concepts of immaterial labor. And so on one hand you have the left-wing researchers who developed this notion of the social factory, also Mario Tronti, and on the other hand you had the artists who developed the sort of basics of a kind of interactive and participatory art before the computer. And that led them also then to start to create environments. Here the German group Effect, the person is actually a Yugoslavian artist, Ivan Čismek, but they created environments that were an invitation to play for people. And that was really very close actually to the, what do you call it, to the Luna Park experience. Yeah? This was like, at the time, critics hated that. That was not art. That's horrible, you know. It's like entertainment. It's not serious. And that was intended because they thought they wanted to make art for the broad mass of people and not just for the chosen few. And they wanted to give people a sort of experience that they could, that would be immediately accessible to them without having to study years and years of art history before. And that went then also further, working with stroboscopic lights, working with installations with neon, electrical switches, and I call this image, which actually, if you look closely, it's a photo collage. So you have this fashionable Parisian art crowd looking at the work by Gianni Colombo, but it never was like that in that form. He pasted the people into the photo of the artwork. I call it the blitz of the new. So it was really about novelty and the sense of newness, and that was very convincing at the time. And this exhibition actually, in 1964 in Paris, the curator William Seitz was led through this exhibition by the US constructivist artist George Rickey, and it was like a shopping tour because many of the exhibitions were then part of the exhibition The Responsive Eye in 1965 at MoMA, which was on one hand a big blockbuster, but on the other hand also created a very critical response. And again, one of these images here, the Group Graf, they created a labyrinth where they had huge, massive works, but also very strong sensual triggers like stroboscopes, mirror rooms, where they sent people through this labyrinth to give them this kind of different destabilizing experience. They called it it was about destabilizing people out of their normal everyday experience. Again, a little bit like the Luna Park. But again, also what was important was here to completely forget about individual authorship. So it was a collective work by Graf and not an individual work, and they created some more of these works later on. And this is what I mentioned early on, the relationship between François Morellet and Saul Levitt. Morellet was really developing this sort of work since the early 1950s, where he worked with grids, and then he just superimposed grids one on each other, and he's just decided on the size of the grid, and then he decided of the angle in which he would twist and turn it. So that is like writing a program, and then he would stand back. He would not interfere. He would not twist. He would not say, oh, it's more beautiful when I do it a little bit like that, or maybe I paint something like that. No, he completely took a disinterested stance, and that was like fighting intuition. For him, intuition was the wrong way forward for artists. That was this old sort of religious sort of thing, and in that way he's really a precursor of software art. And the interesting thing is he could do it as a design on a gridded piece of paper, very small, as a drawing, and you could see it, you could make it also on this sort of mega size on house walls. And funny is that actually the work was destroyed because that's where they later built the Centre Pompidou. And this exhibition in New York, the Responsive Eye, on this occasion actually the term op art was invented, and that was for New Tendencies it was described as a first-class burial because their aesthetics became mainstream, was very successful on the market, but all their political concerns about activating the spectator, about addressing people's political agency, all that was completely forgotten. So their aesthetics was captured by the market, but their political concerns were sidelined. And that created a serious concern for New Tendencies. You can say New Tendencies as a neo-avant-garde movement was over by 1965. And they had this symposium here where in this wonderful Baroque castle they actually tried to decide what would be the future of this movement. It has been recorded. I listened to some of the recordings. It was really a bit of a depressed atmosphere. But there was one person, don't see him here, the French theorist Abraham Moll, who told them about a new machine for making art, the computer, and who had a fantastic theory about the computer creating a generative aesthetics. He called it permutative aesthetics. And with that, you could create individual artwork for every home. So you could program a computer to create this information aesthetics, the most beautiful work, and every consumer, every normal person could have at their kitchen table or at their wallpaper such a generative permutative aesthetics, which was a kind of utopia of information aesthetics of Abraham Moll. And that seems to have influenced New Tendencies, so that after a break in 1968, they turned to the computer as a medium of visual research. They still avoided the term art, so they said the computer as a medium of visual research. And here is one of the earliest works by Frieder Nake, a German computer artist of the first generation. And what you can see here, of course, it was very simple. It had to be simple. Computers were still mainframes at the time. There existed no software. Everything had to be written in machine language or Fortran. And Frieder Nake was also doing that. He was his job actually as a young faculty member in Stuttgart was to program the Zuse Graphomat, the first drawing machine for German computer company Zuse. And actually, at first, he just made squares and circles, and then the machine went a bit wild, and then he saw, oh, it looks like modern art, actually. So I could also use it to make art. And then he became one of the first computer artists. But the more serious background is that at the time, the computer was used in a very particular discourse on the computer being the better artist. Actually, Michael A. Noll from Bell Labs made a work, this work here, which was shown in a magazine which was issued by New Tendencies, Bit International. I think it's possible to find the PDF somewhere. There are 9 issues of this magazine. It's fantastic. It has all these discussions on information aesthetics, but also computer-based typoetry and so on. And what Noll did, he took a famous painting by Piet Mondrian, one of the first completely abstract paintings, and he recreated it using a computer. And then he had reproductions of both works, and he walked around Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey, and he asked the people 2 questions. Which one is made by the computer, and which one is made by a human person, and which one do you like better? And according to Noll, the majority of the people sort of mixed it up. The majority thought the computer work was done by Mondrian and vice versa, and the majority also liked the computer work better. So that was used as an argument to say, in the future, all the art will be made by computers. All we need is a kind of skilled programming and a new profession, a kind of digital aestheticist, somebody who decides on the programs, and then we don't need art schools anymore. Everything will be perfect. We don't need art schools. We don't need artists who are always difficult people, and we can just, yeah. So, and that discourse was really strong. Even Frieder Nake, who is a lovely person I had the opportunity to meet, and he's teaching in Bremen, and he made this, at least he still called it a homage to Paul Klee. So he made the computer draw something which looks a little bit like a drawing by Paul Klee, but I think most people would here know which is which. And this was all theorized heavily in symposia in 68, 69, symposia which were very international. I briefly showed this image of Hiroshi Kawano, a Japanese computer artist, also one of the true pioneers of computer art, unfortunately almost forgotten. And at this symposium also there was a group which comes of all places from Kansas City, Art Research Center group, and they had their own take on computer art and cybernetics. They drew a huge diagram here. That's Nancy Stevens, and they made this diagram. They interpreted already, they had some ideas like almost like open source and like the commons movement. They said we use the computer and cybernetics for a self-organized group activity. Yeah? We don't use it just for making art, but we use computers how to organize ourselves better as a group, as a collectivity. And a very interesting approach, I think, which unfortunately somehow has been largely missed, and this is an appeal to you, critical study people here. I think I should not research that, but Art Research Center Group is still around. Michael Stevens is very active, and they just have their 60th anniversary or something. And so they would be extremely happy if somebody bothered to write about them and do some research on them. But my argument is that at the time, this discourse on the computer as the better artist, which was very ideological, very much against human labor, and which was kind of mirrored by an argument in industry where you had sort of the automation of industry, again, against human labor, against organized labor, against the trade unions and so on, that this discourse somehow overshadowed more interesting artwork using the computer, which also happened. So at the time, the computer show in Zagreb happened at the same time as Cybernetic Serendipity in London, which is quite well known, where you had, I don't know, dozens of big companies showing gadgets, also some computer art. And this is what German artist Gustav Metzger, who lived in London for most of his life, what he had to say about it. It was the time of the Vietnam War, and he wrote, I don't like to read from the screen, but he said, like, there is no end of computers composing haikus, but no hint that computers dominate modern war, that they are becoming the most totalitarian tools ever used in society. And if you look at today what's happening with the NSA, with surveillance, and with drones and all that, we have a similar situation where very often in digital art, only the creative possibilities of computation are highlighted, whereas all those other aspects are excluded actually from the discussions. And so it looked actually, for a time, it looked like computer-based art would become the new thing in art around 68, 69, 1970. In New York, you had two really important exhibitions. You had Software by Jack Burnham, and you had Information. Both tried to bring together computer art and conceptual art, and it really looked like that would be the future. But for some reasons, maybe a point for debate, it didn't happen like that. There was a profound change in the way people felt. Probably the Vietnam War played a big role in that, but also other issues, the '68 revolution, hippie movement, a new sort of ecological sensibility, and that's what actually happened. So the artists sort of left that whole technological paradigm. They started doing conceptual art, body art, land art, all sorts of things. This is the Slovenian group OHO, and they went rapidly through all the steps from sort of a kind of a paraphrasing pop art to conceptual art to visual poetry, and then they invented something they called transcendental conceptualism, where they made telepathic artworks for the Information exhibition, and then in the next step they made these sort of group experiments in nature. In the next step afterwards, they gave up art and they formed a commune. So there was this movement out, actually, of art, or at least driving art to a point where it was not really easily recognizable as art, where it became performance, where it didn't produce any objects, where it was becoming dematerialized, as Lucy Lippard said. And that was going on pretty much throughout the 1970s. There were also very strong variations of that in former Yugoslavia. This is a really famous work by Balint Szombathy. He is a Hungarian-speaking artist, but from Yugoslavia, from a border region. And he made this work, Lenin in Budapest. So in former Soviet-dominated countries, people always had to go demonstrate for the socialist revolution. And especially on 1st of May, there were big demonstrations, but organized from above. And what Balint did, when the main demonstration was already over, he carried his own little Lenin placard through Budapest as a kind of very silent form of protest against the use of those iconic images and against also how empty the ideology had already become. And the ideology had not only become empty in places, in countries such as Budapest or Prague. You may remember the Prague Spring was closed down by Soviet tanks, but also in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav experiment, which had started out very beautifully, being based on the notion of self-management. Then there came a really interesting episode, the Yugoslav '68, where the students actually said to the political leaders, listen, we have this official ideology of self-management. We don't want something else, but we want you to actually implement self-management. Just do what our constitution says. And that, of course, was not possible. So in a way, Yugoslavia went into a stage where it became increasingly fossilized. There was a cult of personality around Tito, and the conceptual artists were very good in sort of deconstructing that. So Yugoslav conceptual art of the time, which is called the New Art Practices, which is one of my next research subjects where I want to go deeper, was very often kind of deconstructing the use of images in ideological sort of urban spaces, and how artists actually reacted to that, also bringing in new topics such as gender and ecology and so on and so forth. And those conditions somehow conspired to make new tendencies look increasingly old. This idea that of this sort of neo-constructivist art, that sort of this programmed art, all this terminology had sort of lost actually its traction, and there was a last large big exhibition in 1973, which was very interesting. They brought together constructive art, conceptual art, and computer art, and they thought there would be a dialogue between the three art forms, but there wasn't. The new art practices were more verbally aggressive. They had the sort of wind of the times behind them, and the old guard of new tendencies just thought, oh, these people, they are not proper leftists anymore, they are postmodern, we don't like that, you know. They don't have a utopian belief, and it's true. The conceptual artists were postmodern. In that sense, they did not believe in any utopian promise of any future anymore. And in that situation, the sort of utopian spirit of new tendencies didn't make any sense, and there was a last attempt of bringing everything together in 1977, 78, under the term of art and society. Very interesting, a totally under-researched event. They wanted to make a big exhibition and conference, but as opposed to the years before, when they sent invitation letters and everybody came, they got a lot of politely being turned down. They invited everybody, all the big names from Germano Zelland, who invented Arte Povera, Hans Hake, and so on and so forth. I think Hake actually came, I have to research that, but most people just politely said, no, sorry, no time, and that was silently sort of the very silent and quiet end of new tendencies. And this is also the end of my talk. I would like to flag up 2 or 3 points maybe. One point is this movement, which at the time had been so big, yeah, 350 artists, being almost hegemonic in Europe, playing a big role in the Responsive Eye exhibition in New York. Why is this new movement nowadays almost completely unknown? Yeah? Why did it vanish completely? The other thing is, by not forgetting it, what do we actually gain? What is the sort of, what kind of insights can we gain from such a movement? That would be a second question I would like to flag up. And the third question I just forgot, and I think that would be up to you to have questions.
My question is a question and I believe a response as well. When you talk about conceptual art, are you also including minimalism? Because it seems that this movement led into minimalism, especially when you talk about computer art and the line. The other statement I had is, you said what was the rebuttal to this? I believe it was artists like Cy Twombly, who then started mark making, showing the human input into art again, which was taken out through something like new tendencies and minimalism.
I think the second point, that's the wrong chronology. New tendencies reacted to that human hand. That was before them. That was quite dominant before they started. And they said this kind of individual gesture just shows the individual psychic state of the artist, and it's not so valuable. We, by making these collective artworks, which are rationally conceived, we can, which are based on a science of perception also, on actual neuroscience and how our visual apparatus works, that's much stronger, that's much more interesting. The first question, that's really, I think, the spring issue of October magazine. There are 2 things in there. There is a new collection of translations of writings by François Morellet, and there's this article by Yves Alamboy about reopening that debate, because what happened was that in 1972, the gallerist of Morellet launched an attack on Sol LeWitt that he was plagiarizing Morellet. So at the time, minimalism was really big, was getting really big, and new tendencies were struggling to get forgotten. And this gallerist said, you know, Morellet has done it 10 years earlier. And in a way, it's true, you know, it's true. So was really, at the time, the rhetoric was maybe over the top, and this article by Yves Alamboy, he reflects that very well. It's a very well-rounded article, but it was really true that there were certain mechanisms where not just Solevit, but they completely distanced themselves of any European influence. And that was also just feeding into what the gallerists did. So it was a time when American gallerists were just becoming dominant quite globally on the art market, and so it suited them very well that also Donald Judd said, I have never been influenced by anything European. And it's not true. So there's a book by a colleague, Midori Yamamura. She wrote a book on Yayoi Kusama, and she showed how Kusama was actually next door neighbor of Donald Judd. And Kusama was not part of New Tendencies, but she was with the Zero network. And she worked with Zero and showed with Zero. So Donald Judd knew about Zero. He knew about that, you know. Dan Flavin knew about that. But they said they publicly distanced themselves from that, and they had the critics behind them. They had more critical firepower with Art Forum. They had the art market behind them. And that's a situation which is very much still in place. So it's kind of that's what I said. Considering New Tendencies affords a reconsidering actually of this post-war modernism. But I think I'm with Yves Alamboy. It's not about Morellet being a precursor of Levitt. That would be a stupid way of putting it. It's not about one plagiarizing the other. Both have been working with algorithms and with grids in a very interesting way, and one was a few years earlier. So I think that would be the thing.
I'm curious, you mentioned Molinage. He would have been at Illinois Institute of Technology post-World War II?
Sorry?
Was there a direct influence between Molinage being in Illinois? Did he have any direct contact with the artists?
Who?
Molinage.
Molinage, he died too early. But the contact was actually that very interesting. It was the other way around. So at the College of Design Ulm, there were several former Bauhaus people. There was, for instance, Josef Albers. And there was sort of, as I said, there was this movement. Those artists, Bauhaus artists, they had been driven out because of fascism. They had to leave Europe, came to the United States, came to places such as the Black Mountain School, and then Moholy-Nagy started this Institute of Design in Chicago. And very interesting small detail is that some of the Croatian participants in New Tendencies, before New Tendencies started in 1950, they actually, at the time, it was still in a sort of post-Stalinist situation. So Yugoslavia did not have a doctrine of socialist realism, but doing abstract art was difficult. But what they could do, they worked as designers for the Yugoslav state, designing trade fair exhibitions. And that gave them the chance to travel, and they came to Chicago for a trade fair, and they immediately went to the Institute of Design, which was also called the New Bauhaus. So there, the figure, the transmitter was Kepes, György Kepes, because Moholy-Nagy died early, and then Kepes was the link, and that also brought a steady flux of people from the United States back to the College of Design Ulm. And there was another part of that story is, of course, that raised a lot of criticism from the left-wing artists of the Situationist International, of the Asger Jorn and the new Bauhaus Imaginist. They called them functionalists, and for them, functionalist was a derogatory term.
So the Yugoslavian founder of New Tendencies, how do I pronounce his name?
Matko Mestrovic.
How did he regard Documenta? Because I know Documenta preceded New Tendencies. I guess Documenta 2 was already established before New Tendencies was founded. So I was wondering how he and the fellow artists that he went on to establish New Tendencies, how did they regard, like what was their
One
feeling
thing, yeah.
regarding
Okay,
Documenta?
so one thing is a small anecdote. He thinks, he told me, I had several long interviews, like life story interviews, and he thinks he was the first Yugoslav art critic ever to visit Documenta.
Which document?
I think the one in, when was the one in, is 58 or 56, the first one I think, 56. But you must consider Documenta was a very different thing. Documenta was quite officially a German reaction to all modern art having been prohibited by the Nazis. It was a way of re-familiarizing the German public with the big names. The first years it was Picasso, Matisse, and so on, the really big names. Yeah, yeah. And then, exactly, it was a nation rebuilding, democratizing people through that. It was quite top-down. And the New Tendencies were the young radicals. So initially, the first exhibition was quite small. And there's a period leading up to New Tendencies, and they were the sort of, they had the artist-run, self-organized spaces. Zero in Düsseldorf had from 57, they had this kind of one-evening exhibitions in their studio. The Piero Manzoni, and they had a gallery in Milan, which was just open for 9 months. But in those 9 months, everybody who is now important passed through that gallery. So those were the sort of people who, at the time, were not in the art system and created their own aesthetics, their own programmatic against the art system, just to be swallowed up by it very quickly.
Do you think that this also had to do with the position of former East in relation to Europe?
Sorry, my hearing is currently a bit bad.
Sorry. Do you think this might also have something to do with the position of the former East in relation to Europe, status and power?
Yes, yes. But one thing I did not go into too much, because it would have just made my talk much longer, is that Yugoslavia had a very special position. As it was not part of the Eastern Bloc, Yugoslavia was was a founding member of the Non-Aligned Nations movement. The Non-Aligned Nations movement was formed after a first conference in 1955 in Bandung in Indonesia, where Nehru of India, Sukarno of Indonesia, Nasser of Egypt, Kwamu from Ghana, and Tito from Yugoslavia decided, okay, there's the capitalist West, and there is the so-called communist East, but they recognized the communist project of the Soviet Union was just another imperialist project, and they decided we should have the right to decide our own path, our own way. And that was the Non-Aligned Nations movement, and Yugoslavia was the only European founding nation, and that gave it such a special position politically, because that meant that their system also at the time was called market socialism. So in a way, it was an open country. Europeans could travel to Yugoslavia visa-free. And for artists from the Soviet bloc, it was also more easy for artists from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary to go to Yugoslavia than to go to a Western country. So that's why they could become such a meeting ground. But that's also the thing, the sad history is that Yugoslavia destroyed itself in a civil war in the 1990s, a fairly recent history, and the nations that came out of that are all fervently anti-socialist. And everything that concerns the past of socialist Yugoslavia, such as New Tendencies, they don't hold in very high esteem. So in Serbia, you would probably have 2,000 people who know the New Tendencies. In Croatia, where I have been, it's a bit better, so they start to embrace it as part of their artistic tradition. But you really have an inequality also in terms of who writes the history and who decides what is important and what goes into the history books and what doesn't. So that's, of course, always a factor. And already at the time, they talked about cultural imperialism, and it's a strong word, but probably something of that kind has been happening.
Thank you, Armin. I thought it was a really brilliant lecture, really interesting to me and really important. For my students, I just want to contextualize a bit the project that you're engaged in. In art history and in curatorial practice over the last decade or maybe 15 years, there's been a lot of work done exploring additional or alternative modernisms. So, when I was educated in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we talked about modernism as if it were a fairly monolithic thing. It was a rather Eurocentric approach to the subject, which really located modernism in Western Europe and then in the United States. And as Armin Medosh mentioned, there was this terrific book by Serge Guilbeault called How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art from Paris. And it was really how abstract expressionism marked this point of transition where the avant-garde, went from, Paris and Western Europe in general to New York, and how that was sort of orchestrated in large part by the United States Department of State and the CIA through a form of literal cultural imperialism, trying to use American avant-garde art as a kind of cultural weapon in the Cold War. But in any case, so what Armin is doing here is part of a larger project that lots of art historians and curators are undertaking to expand our definition of modernism so that we understand that things were happening all over the world simultaneously, and how all these different modernisms are, they're aware of each other, but they're also all symptomatic of similar macro trends, for example, industrialization, right, which he was talking about at the beginning. So now for a question. You sort of wanted to flag up a couple of points, and one was, why has the history of new tendencies why was it either not written or erased? And of course, you can understand not writing as almost a form, like a passive form of erasure. And my sense is you have a hypothetical answer to your own question. So I'd ask you why you think that is, and then, I might respond to that.
Half of the answer we have already discussed. There were these mechanisms that New York became the capital of modern art. Artists who were actually influenced at some point by those European artists who had seen the responsive eye. For instance, it's known that Sol LeWitt has seen Morellet's work in '65, and he started his own work with grids a year later. But that would be nitpicking about, but what they did, they distanced themselves from their sort of any European influence. That played hand in hand with the art market, with the way, the direction that galleries went. And again, it was not just about geographical regions or directions. It's really an important book also by Midori Yamamura about Yayoi Kusama. I mean, Kusama was so important in New York in '61, and then she left. She left because she did never make it. She did never get a proper gallery representation here. Yeah? So those mechanisms also conspired against women, against non-European women in particular, and those were very strong mechanisms which then also continued in the way art history was done until recently. And you are right, it's a real project now recovering these sort of decentered modernisms. And I happen to have been at a few conferences, and it's a really great thing. The other thing that happened is maybe, and that's more my personal answer, is that new tendencies really at some point, they tried to more formally constitute themselves as a movement. And as I said, there had been these different currencies within new tendencies, the more abstract, rational, socialist wing with actually not the Yugoslavs, that was funny, but actually more with the Italian and French artists. And there this more lyrical, poetical, sensible, light ballet, sort of German, Austro-Hungarian wing or whatever. And what happened in '63, they tried to expulse all those people. So the French rationalists, they did the classical Breton thing, we're making a movement, we have to kick out everybody who is not completely following our line. And one of the issues was, for instance, they made lists of who is in and who is out. And they gave reasons why people were kicked out. Yeah? And there's a funny correspondences in the archive. The history of new tendencies is fairly well preserved in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Zagreb, not in digital form, but in carton boxes. And the letters are really funny. So they sent letters to Otto Biene and Heinz Mack, and they said, your latest work doesn't suit with the current development of our movement. Please send other work. Yeah? And then when they made lists, they also gave reasons, as I said. And one reason, because as I explained, Morellet had this very strong drive against intuition. And generally, they wanted to get rid of the hand of the artist. That was an ideologically driven thing. It should not show the hand of the artist, because they thought in a modern industrial society, that's ancient. Yeah? And so, for instance, so they accused some artists of sensible execution. So you were supposed to decide on your algorithm, a set of proceedings and materials which you would use, and then you would carry out the algorithm without any sensible execution. If you had sensible, okay, you're out sensible execution. Yeah.
It reminds me of you made reference to Saul LeWitt in his paragraphs on conceptual art. He wrote, in conceptual art, the idea is a machine that makes the work. Execution is a perfunctory affair.
Totally the same. That's why I said that's this relation, Morellet and Saul LeWitt. It's a really close relation. Again, I think it would be wrong to say that LeWitt stole from Morellet, maybe some subconscious influence, but maybe also such things come up at the same time in different parts of the world. And and it was this idea of making an art adequate for an advanced industrial society, actually. Where this craft-based approach, I mean, Duchamp made that gesture 60 years or 50 years earlier, actually. Yeah.
Can you talk more about how the computer art was political? It was specifically because of the decision of changing the media at that time, or
how it was?
The relation between computer art and political, like how it was political.
Okay. So yeah, that was a big question. It was a big problem, because you can really say there were two phases. There was the first phase from 61 to 65, where you had those groups and collectives. Group N, actually there was an American group involved, also completely forgotten, with a beautiful name, Anonyma. They were from Cleveland, Ohio. Very interesting would be to research them. And there was a Russian group called Vishenye. So in the first phase, there were these movements, and they had this idea of participatory art in order to activate the spectator. And they used this notion of research and programmed art. But if you look at how the works were made, they were totally simple. This is what actually any slightly skilled human person could do. They were not such great craftsmen. Yeah? And then they had this break, and then it was more like a forward flight. They saw their aesthetics had conquered the art market without any concern for their politics. And then they got this idea of making visual research with the computer, but how to? I mean, at the time, getting access to a mainframe computer was really difficult. So when they had the second phase of New Tendencies, which started in 68, 69, there was almost a complete change of personnel. There were only 5 artists from the first phase who then switched to working with a computer. And that also meant getting access to a computer, and very often also finding a technician to work with. So in 68, 69, they made not just one event, but a series of events. And in May 69, that was really big, with a competition in computer art. And you had a new type of collective who was the winner, which was the American Corporation. Actually, the first prize went to computer graphics in California, and the second to Boeing. So in a way, the kind of politicized collectives of New Tendencies were replaced by corporations who had the financial means to do computer art. So you had Boeing, I forgot his name, Computer Graphics. It's a very famous company. They still exist, or they existed for a long time in California. Anyway, and also Bell Labs. Yeah? So they were the computer artists, and they had great people. It's not that I want to dismiss the people. There were programmers like Kenneth Knowlton, Michael Knoll. They did great work. It was technically innovative, but formally a bit boring. It was two-dimensional graphics, mostly on paper, and it was really just about aesthetics. And one of the few artists of that generation, actually Charles Jury, is one of the few who made this fantastic work, Random War, who actually did address the Vietnam War. But within the New Tendencies, that actually led to a small scandal, because when they had that symposium, one of the participants of the first phase came, Alberto Biasi, and he said, how can you do this? You know, how can you now focus on computer art when around the whole world is exploding? We have Paris May, we have Italian hot autumn of '69. It was not just Paris, it was a global movement. It was not just about Vietnam, it was about many things. It was a new social imaginary, actually. And then in Zagreb, they were thinking about flow chart diagrams. There's a term actually coming from science studies about a sort of Cold War rationality. And it's possible, I don't want to wave the finger at you, Dennis, but it's possible that among some of the older school also there was this link coming from art concrete and from this mathematical approach in art and this interest in information aesthetic and cybernetics, that has this slight overlap with this Cold War rationality. And in a way, '68 sort of blew that away. People did not follow that anymore. There was a new sensibility, and that's why I also showed those Slovenian artists. They made different things, and the young people made different things. And New Tendencies were just a few years older, but that already created a split. I hope, does that answer your question?